The desert town of Redemption lay silent at dusk, its streets coated in wind-blown dust. A lone rider approached, a woman draped in a black dress that caught the fading sunlight like a shadow on fire. Horses snorted nervously as she passed, and children hid behind wooden fences. Men stared, only for their eyes to widen with terror, each one glimpsing his own grave carved into the barren earth. Jack leaned against a saloon post, his scarred hands tightening on a bottle, whispering, "This ain't natural." Thomas muttered, "Who is she?" Sheriff Cole stiffened outside his office, the badge on his chest glinting cold, while old Ben whispered a prayer under his breath. The woman dismounted slowly, her face unreadable, her eyes burning with something eternal. Evelyn's black boots crunched on the dust as silence spread, broken only by the hollow rattle of a swinging saloon door. The townsfolk gathered in hushed clusters, their whispers sharp as knives. Men who locked eyes with Evelyn paled, each one shaken by visions of their own graves. Jack muttered, "I seen death before, but not like this." Thomas stared at the ground, his voice low. "She carries something we can't name." Sheriff Cole stood rigid, his jaw tight, while Evelyn walked slowly toward the saloon, her footsteps echoing like iron on stone. The sun dipped lower, and shadows stretched long across the wooden planks. Old Ben whispered, "This town's about to pay its debts." Inside the saloon, silence gripped the air as Evelyn pushed through the door. Cards froze mid-air in gamblers' hands, glasses stopped halfway to lips. Jack entered behind her, his boots heavy on the creaking floorboards. "She's trouble," he said quietly, his voice breaking the silence. Thomas hovered near the doorway, his eyes darting nervously between faces. The bartender wiped his brow with trembling hands. Sheriff Cole entered moments later, his badge catching the dim light, his gaze locked on Evelyn. She stood in the center, unmoved, her dark eyes sweeping the room like judgment. The silence shattered as a drunk gambler laughed nervously, pointing at Evelyn. "Ain't no ghost scarin' me," he slurred, but his hand shook as he reached for his drink. His eyes met hers, and suddenly he gasped, clutching his chest, collapsing to the floor. The crowd recoiled, chairs scraping wood. Jack said, "He saw it." Thomas whispered, "His grave." Cole clenched his jaw, anger and unease mixing on his face. Evelyn remained motionless, her gaze cold, her shadow long against the saloon wall. Old Ben stepped inside, voice trembling, "The reckoning's begun." The saloon erupted in chaos. Men scrambled for the door, boots thudding and chairs toppling. Evelyn did not move, her eyes fixed on Jack. His heart pounded as he whispered, "What do you want from us?" Evelyn finally spoke, her voice low and sharp. "I want the truth." Thomas froze at her words, realizing she was not death, but something worse, judgment. Sheriff Cole placed his hand on his revolver, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. Old Ben leaned against the wall, his voice heavy with sorrow. "There ain't no truth here that won't bury us all." Morning light bled across Redemption, but the town carried the same weight as the night before. Evelyn walked alone down the street, her black dress trailing in the dust, every gaze pulling back in fear. Jack sat at a table outside the saloon, rubbing his temples, whispering, "She ain't gone." Thomas leaned forward, voice cracking, "She ain't here for us, is she?" Jack's eyes narrowed. "Boy, she's here for all of us." Sheriff Cole emerged from his office, face grim, his gaze following Evelyn with distrust. Old Ben shuffled closer, muttering, "She's a mirror. She makes men face themselves." The sound of Evelyn's boots echoed louder than the church bell, turning heads as if each step pulled the grave closer. In the church, sunlight poured through stained glass, casting fractured colors across wooden pews. The townsfolk gathered in nervous silence, whispers floating like ghosts. The preacher spoke of redemption, but his voice trembled as he glanced at Evelyn seated in the back. Jack kept his hat low, whispering to Thomas, "You don't pray away what she carries." Thomas whispered back, "Then what do we do?" Jack's jaw tightened. "You face it." Sheriff Cole entered, boots echoing, his eyes fixed on Evelyn with unspoken challenge. Old Ben leaned on a cane, his words rough. Men fear graves they dug themselves. Evelyn did not speak, her gaze heavy, her shadow stretching long beneath the stained glass. Later in the saloon, tension simmered over whiskey and dust. Men spoke in low voices, recounting what they saw when they met Evelyn's eyes. One man swore he saw his coffin nailed shut. Another muttered of a noose swaying in the wind. Jack slammed his glass down. She ain't showing nothing that ain't already waiting. Thomas leaned closer, his voice shaking. But if it's already there, what's the point? Sheriff Cole pushed through the crowd, declaring, "She's here to break this town and I'll stop her." Evelyn stood near the far wall, silent, watching with eyes that pulled confessions out of men's throats without a word spoken. Jack stepped outside into the cooling evening air, the sky painted red by the setting sun. Thomas followed, restless, asking, "Why don't we just leave?" Jack shook his head. "Ain't no runnin' from what's inside you." Old Ben approached, leaning on his cane, eyes heavy with memory. "Long ago," he said, "I saw her too. She don't come for towns, she comes for sins." Jack studied him with disbelief. "And you lived?" Ben's voice cracked. "A man don't live the same after staring at his grave." Evelyn stood at the edge of the street, her black dress caught in the dying wind, her presence stretching farther than the horizon. That night, the saloon filled with candlelight and unease. Men drank in silence, flinching at shadows on the walls. Evelyn sat alone at a table, untouched drink before her, her eyes fixed on Sheriff Cole across the room. He stared back, hand resting on his revolver, the air thick with challenge. Jack whispered to Thomas, "He wants her gone." Thomas frowned. "And if he tries?" Jack muttered, "Then this town'll bury more than it bargained for." Old Ben played a quiet tune on a weathered harmonica, the notes sharp as a knife in the silence. Evelyn's shadow loomed, stretching across the floor, swallowing the flicker of the candlelight. The following morning, Redemption's air carried a heavy stillness. Men avoided the street, doors stayed bolted, and whispers echoed from shuttered windows. Jack leaned against a water trough, staring at the dust as Thomas paced. "The whole town's rotting," Thomas said, voice tight. Jack sighed. "Fear does that quicker than bullets." Sheriff Cole stepped out, scanning the silent buildings, his hand resting on his revolver. "She's turned the people against themselves," he muttered. Evelyn walked past, her gaze never shifting, the black dress flowing behind her. Old Ben followed at a distance, cane tapping the ground, his voice rasping. "Secrets don't stay buried forever." Inside the sheriff's office, maps and wanted posters lined the wall. Sheriff Cole poured whiskey into a tin cup, his voice low. "If she stays, this town burns." Jack leaned across the desk, his jaw set. "It's not her burnin' it, Cole, it's us." Thomas shifted uneasily near the door, eyes darting to the barred window. Evelyn's shadow fell across the room from outside, the light bending strangely as she passed. Cole slammed his cup down, growling, "You think she's innocent? She's the spark." Old Ben, seated in the corner, shook his head slowly. "You can't blame the fire on the wind," he whispered. Silence pressed heavy on them all. That night, the townsfolk gathered in the saloon, voices loud with fear and whiskey. One man shouted, "She's cursed us!" Another pounded the table, eyes wide, "I saw my coffin nailed shut." Jack stood slowly, his voice cutting through the noise. "She ain't showing us death, she's showing us what we made." The room quieted, men glancing nervously at Evelyn standing near the wall, her expression still as stone. Thomas whispered, "They'll turn on her." Sheriff Cole pushed through the crowd, his voice sharp, "Maybe they should." Evelyn lifted her head slightly, eyes reflecting the lamplight, and silence fell heavy once more. Outside, wind swept dust across the street as Evelyn walked slowly toward the church. Jack followed, calling after her. "Why here? Why now?" Evelyn stopped, her voice quiet, "Because the graves here are deeper than most." Thomas caught up, his voice breaking. "You mean us?" She turned her eyes on him, and he flinched, as if glimpsing something unspeakable. Jack stepped between them, protective, his hand near his holster. From the shadows, Sheriff Cole watched, muttering, "She'll tear him apart." Old Ben leaned against the church rail, shaking his head. "No, boy. She ain't here to tear. She's here to show." That night, Jack sat alone outside the saloon, staring at the stars dimmed by dust. Thomas joined him, restless. "You ever see your grave, Jack?" he asked. Jack's voice was low, heavy. "Every day I wake up, I see it. Don't need her for that." Thomas pressed, "Then why's she here?" Jack looked toward the dark street where Evelyn's figure stood under a flickering lantern. "Maybe to remind us that graves ain't always in the ground," he muttered. Sheriff Cole strode past, glaring at them both. Old Ben's harmonica played faintly in the distance, each note sharp as a blade cutting through the night. The church bell tolled at midnight, its hollow echo cutting through the dark. Evelyn stood alone inside the church, lit only by a single flickering lantern. Jack entered quietly, his revolver at his hip, but his hands empty. "You've haunted this town long enough," he said. Evelyn turned slowly, her eyes burning. "I don't bring death. I show what's already inside them." Jack stepped closer, voice breaking. "Then why me?" she whispered. "Because you've carried your grave longer than any of them." Thomas appeared in the doorway, breathless, and froze at the sight. Old Ben leaned in from the shadows, his voice weary. "Truth's always heavier than a coffin." The next day, whispers spread like wildfire. Men gathered outside the saloon, arguing in sharp tones. One snarled, "She's the devil's hand." Another spat, "No, she's punishment for what we done." Jack tried to quiet them, saying, "You can't kill what she shows you." Sheriff Cole arrived, his voice booming, "Then I'll kill her anyway." Evelyn appeared at the far end of the street, her shadow long in the morning sun. Thomas muttered, "She doesn't fight back." Old Ben raised his cane. "That's because she doesn't need to. The fight's already inside you." Silence fell as Evelyn stopped, her eyes sweeping over the crowd like judgment itself. That evening, Jack confronted Evelyn near the abandoned cemetery. Rows of weathered crosses leaned in the wind. The ground cracked with neglect. "Why graves?" he demanded. Evelyn touched a cross with her fingertips, saying softly, "Because a man's sins always bury him first." Jack's voice shook. "And mine?" She met his eyes, and he flinched as if struck. "You already know," she whispered. Thomas stumbled forward, pleading, "Don't do this to him." Evelyn turned her gaze on him and he froze, staring at a vision unseen by others. Old Ben placed a hand on Thomas's shoulder, steadying him, muttering, "Every man must see." Sheriff Cole gathered armed men inside the saloon, lanterns casting hard shadows on their grim faces. "She's tearing this town apart," he growled, "and I won't let her take it from me." Jack stormed in, fists clenched. "You ain't saving this town, Cole. You're strangling it." The men shifted uneasily, torn between fear and loyalty. Thomas whispered, "Jack, don't push him." Cole slammed his hand on the table, rattling glasses. "She's mine to deal with." Old Ben leaned against the wall, shaking his head. "No man owns the truth, Cole," he said. Evelyn appeared in the doorway, silent, her presence chilling the room. The truth struck the town like thunder. Evelyn revealed her secret to Jack, in a voice as steady as stone. "I am no reaper, no curse. I am what you cannot escape, your guilt." Jack staggered back, whispering, "All this time, it's been us." Thomas gripped his arm, pale. "Jack, what does that mean?" Sheriff Cole sneered, "Then she's nothing but smoke and lies." Evelyn's eyes fixed on him, her voice low. "Then why do you see your grave every time you look at me?" Cole faltered, his bravado cracking. Old Ben whispered hoarsely, "Now the veil's torn, and no man can hide." A storm brewed above Redemption, clouds rolling dark across the sky. Men huddled inside the saloon, arguing in frantic voices. "She'll drive us all to madness," one shouted. Another muttered, "We'll die if we stay." Jack stood, his voice calm but firm. "It ain't her killing us. It's the graves we dug." Thomas clenched his fists, whispering, "Then what do we do, Jack?" Jack looked out the window at Evelyn, walking through the rain-dusted street, her black dress whipping in the wind. Sheriff Cole slammed his fist on the table, snarling, "She dies tonight." Old Ben shook his head, whispering, "You can't kill what's already inside you." Rain pelted the street as Evelyn walked slowly, her shadow stretching under flashes of lightning. Jack stepped outside, soaked instantly, staring at her. "Why here?" he demanded, voice nearly lost in the storm. Evelyn's eyes met his, steady and cold. "Because this town has bled too long." Thomas ran after Jack, his voice breaking. "She's tearing us apart." Jack shook his head. "No, she's showing us the pieces we already broke." Sheriff Cole emerged from the sheriff's office, revolver in hand, his face twisted with rage. Old Ben leaned against the saloon rail, muttering, "The storm don't end till the truth is told." Inside the saloon, fear turned to violence. A man pulled a knife, yelling, "We end her tonight." Another drew his gun, eyes wild. Jack stormed in, shouting, "Put it down before you bury yourselves." Thomas tried to calm the crowd, but panic spread. Evelyn entered quietly, her wet dress dripping across the wooden floor, her eyes sweeping the room. The armed men froze, weapons trembling in their hands. Sheriff Cole pushed forward, raising his revolver. "This ends now." Evelyn's voice cut sharp as thunder. "No, Sheriff. This only begins when truth is faced." Old Ben's harmonica wailed a sorrowful note from the corner. The storm raged harder as Jack confronted Cole in the middle of the street. Thunder rolled, lightning splitting the sky. Jack shouted, "She ain't your enemy, Cole. You are." Cole aimed his revolver, rain dripping off his hat brim. "You always were a coward, Jack," he sneered. Thomas cried out, "Stop this!" but his voice was drowned by the wind. Evelyn stood at the edge of the street, her presence unshaken by the storm. Old Ben muttered, "The storm's just a mirror. It shows the cracks we already carry." Jack's hand hovered near his holster, his breath ragged, his eyes burning with fury. The town spiraled into chaos. Men ran through the streets, guns firing into the storm as if to chase their visions away. Windows shattered, horses bolted, and fear roared louder than thunder. Jack grabbed Thomas, pulling him into cover. "Don't let the fear take you," he shouted. Thomas cried, "It already has." Sheriff Cole fired into the sky, screaming, "I'll burn this town to save it." Evelyn walked calmly through the madness, her eyes unblinking, her shadow flickering across the lightning. Old Ben's voice carried faintly, "This is the breaking. Every man meets himself tonight." Dawn broke over redemption, the storm finally spent, leaving silence heavier than gunfire. Jack stood in the middle of the street, his hand resting near his holster, breath steady. Sheriff Cole emerged from the opposite end, his coat swaying with each step. The townsfolk gathered at the edges, faces pale, afraid to blink. Thomas whispered from behind Jack, "You don't have to do this." Jack answered without looking back, "I've been doing this my whole life." Evelyn stood on the boardwalk, her gaze locked on them both, her presence a silent witness. Old Ben muttered low, "This ain't just a duel, it's a reckoning." The town held its breath as Jack and Cole faced each other, boots planted firm in the dust. Cole's voice carried sharp and cruel, "You always were a coward, Jack. Now the whole town sees it." Jack's eyes narrowed, his voice steady, "Cowardice is hiding behind a badge while burying the truth." The crowd murmured, fear tightening every throat. Thomas whispered desperately, "Please, Jack, walk away." Evelyn spoke softly, her voice cutting through the air. "No one walks away from themselves." Cole smirked coldly, lifting his revolver slightly. Old Ben muttered, "One of them won't see the sunset tonight." The first gunshot cracked like thunder, dust exploding from the ground between them. Jack and Cole drew fast, their hands blurs of motion. The crowd gasped, women screamed, children clutched at mothers' skirts. Jack's revolver fired again, his arm steady, his face carved with fury. Cole's bullet ripped past Jack's shoulder, grazing him, while Jack's shot struck Cole's side. Cole staggered, teeth clenched, but stayed on his feet, blood spreading across his coat. Thomas cried out, "Jack!" Evelyn's eyes burned brighter, her gaze fixed on Cole. Old Ben whispered, "A wound don't end a man if his pride's still breathing." Cole snarled through the pain, raising his revolver again, his eyes wild with fury. "You think you can take this town from me?" he shouted. Jack fired once more, his bullet tearing Cole's arm, the weapon falling into the dust. The crowd gasped, stepping back as Cole dropped to one knee, clutching his wound. Evelyn stepped forward, her voice calm and cold. "You've seen your grave, Sheriff. You dug it yourself." Cole glared at her, sweat mixing with blood. Thomas whispered, "It's over." Old Ben muttered bitterly, "It ain't over till the ground's closed." Jack's breath came heavy, his revolver still ready. The silence after the final shot felt louder than thunder. Cole collapsed fully, his breath ragged, eyes glazing as the dust swallowed him. Jack lowered his revolver slowly, his hand trembling, eyes filled with both relief and sorrow. Thomas rushed to his side, whispering, "You did it." Jack shook his head, voice breaking, "No, boy, we all did this." Evelyn's gaze lingered on Jack, her eyes reflecting both judgment and mercy. She whispered, "You've carried your grave long enough." Old Ben leaned heavy on his cane, voice low, "One man's fall don't wash away the town's sins." The sun blazed down, merciless and bright. The dust settled slowly over Redemption's main street, the silence broken only by the soft rattle of wind through broken shutters. Sheriff Cole's body lay still in the dirt, his badge half buried in sand. Jack stood over him, revolver lowered, shoulders heavy with exhaustion. Thomas stepped forward cautiously, whispering, "It's finished, Jack." Jack shook his head, his voice hoarse, "Ain't nothing finished. The graves are still here." Evelyn watched from the boardwalk, her black dress rippling in the wind, eyes unreadable. Old Ben's cane tapped once against the wood as he muttered, "One man falls, but the sins don't vanish." The townsfolk emerged slowly, their faces pale, eyes fixed on the sheriff's fallen body. Some whispered prayers, others cursed under their breath. A woman clutched her child tightly, as if death itself had passed by. Jack turned to them, his voice strained. This town dug its own grave, same as him. Thomas looked around, his face pale, whispering, "Can it be rebuilt?" Evelyn's gaze swept the crowd, her words sharp as steel, "Not rebuilt, only faced." Old Ben muttered, "A man can build walls over bones, but the bones remain." The crowd lowered their eyes, unable to meet hers. That evening, the saloon was quiet, lanterns flickering against warped wood. Jack sat at a table alone, glass untouched, staring at nothing. Thomas approached slowly, voice soft, "You saved us." Jack shook his head. "I didn't save nothing. We're still buried, boy, just not all in the ground." Evelyn stood in the doorway, her shadow cutting across the floorboards, her eyes fixed on Jack. "You faced it," she said. Jack looked up, his voice breaking. "Then why does it feel heavier?" Old Ben played a slow, mournful tune on his harmonica, each note drifting like smoke across the silence. The next morning, Evelyn walked to the edge of town, her boots leaving faint prints in the dust. Jack followed her a few steps, stopping short. "Will you ever stop?" he asked quietly. Evelyn turned slightly, her face calm, her voice steady. "When men stop fearing their graves." Thomas called from behind, "Will we see you again?" Evelyn glanced back, her eyes unreadable. "Only if you bury the truth again." Old Ben stood by the well, muttering, "She don't come or go. She just waits till we're ready to see." Jack lowered his head, unable to answer. Evelyn disappeared into the rising sun, her figure fading with each step, until only dust remained. Jack stood in the street, revolver holstered, his eyes fixed on the empty horizon. Thomas placed a hand on his arm, whispering, "It's over." Jack's voice was low, heavy. "It ain't over, it just ain't finished." Old Ben lowered his head, his voice breaking, "On graves still waiting, and none of us know whose." The townsfolk drifted back into silence, the weight of what remained heavy in the air. The wind carried Evelyn's shadow away, leaving the last grave unmarked in the dust.